Would you stand one more time? Little Bridge Church aerobics. Stand one more time. I'm going to read our scripture this morning. It comes from Ephesians 4, a very familiar letter around here, and it says the following: Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. Just as in Christ God forgave you. You guys can be seated this morning. So we've been having a conversation around forgiveness for a few weeks this Christmas season. As you reflect on that question, have any of you had to forgive someone this week? Have any of you been in need of forgiving someone or being forgiven this week? We had an amazing family day, baking yesterday, baking breads, baking sausage balls, making casseroles, just having a fun day. And we had to forgive one another throughout the day. I'll leave it at that. We live in a hurting world. She's like, you're not going to tell the story of throwing juice in your daughter's face? No, I'm not going to tell it. We live in a hurting world. She started it. And we are hurting people. She threw the first bottle. And to hurt or to hurt one another, I apologize later as I was giving her a bath from the sticky apple juice in her hair and face. To hurt or to hurt one another, that is natural. But to forgive, that's supernatural. Forgiveness is the conversation right now. Why? Why at Christmas? Why are you bringing forgiveness and bad relationships and struggles behind the scenes into this time of year? It's because, let's be honest, Christmas at the surface is very excited and gingerbread cookies hopping on stage, but beneath the surface, how many of you have been hit by the struggle bus during this time of year? The struggle bus, I think, is pulled into about everyone's driveway in unique ways. And forgiveness is part of that journey. That's why we're naming it. And I think of forgiveness as a door. It's an invitation. It's a pathway. And part of what is on the other side of forgiveness through that door is just new life. And I want to remind us, let's think about this, that forgiveness is so important to God that God sent Jesus to live a life we couldn't live, to pay a price we couldn't pay, to open the door to new life through the power of, everybody say, forgiveness. Forgiveness. It's not just a door to new life with God, it's a door to new life with ourselves. When we learn to forgive others and receive God's forgiveness and even forgive ourselves, we have a new lease on life. There's freedom. And it's a journey in this ever complicated journey of wholeness and the mending of our brokenness. It's a door to new life with other people. And it's also a door to freedom. If unforgiveness is like a prison cell that traps you, forgiveness is kind of like the custom key that unlocks the door. Forgiveness is also it's a door to personal growth. We can despiritualize it for a second. Take Jesus out of the equation if you're not on board with that yet, and you're just curious. Forgiving people, it's just transformative. It changes us. It grows us. It matures us. And forgiveness is a door into that thing that Jesus talked about all the time called the kingdom life. It's what he talked about, that it's where life is meant to be lived and experienced, what he called life and life to the full. And it's powerful and amazing and transformative, and the invitation that goes so deep this season and every day for forgiveness, as powerful as it is, it's rarely easy. And it's often slow. And it's very painful, and as a journey over the course of our lifetimes, it's often messy and mysterious and confusing. And this morning, maybe it's in the realm of forgiveness, or maybe it's something totally different underneath the surface. I bet there's more than one of you that walked in today feeling like a screw-up, undeserving of what this season means, undeserving of God's forgiveness. Maybe you feel like an unforgiving mess and you're trying to forgive someone else. You're trying to forgive yourself. You're trying to make peace with God because he has made you mad. He didn't come through like you thought. Can I tell you something from one fellow screw-up to another? Like, you're in a room full of screw-ups this morning. You're in a room full of screw-ups this morning. We exist to be like a home for being screwed up a little bit. And in our desire for what's real, part of why we gather as a church family is that screw-ups like ourselves have a people to belong as we attempt to follow Jesus together. And listen, what's really amazing about Jesus is that he has this track record. He has this history of loving screw-ups and forgiving screw-ups and restoring screw-ups and even using screw-ups to change the world. And he also has this secondary challenge. He says, yeah, I forgave you, I restored you, I've given you purpose. Now do that for your fellow screw-ups. Become a forgiver, become a restorer, become someone who lives with a purpose to see other people find hope. So let's stir ourselves to faith a little bit today, okay? Can we stir ourselves? Can we be like David, who prayed at his soul and said, rise up within me, awake my soul. Can we awaken our expectation a little bit this morning? I know it's heavy, but I also know that through the fog and through the heaviness is a clearing. It's a new sunrise in the midst of darkness, that we can rise up. We can exercise some faith because Jesus, our forgiver, our healer, our restorer, our hope, and our purpose giver is not hung up on the same things that you're hung up on this morning. Stop beating yourself up. Stop beating that person up. He's not hung up on your prior performance. Instead, he's consumed with love for you. Like he is actively, think about this. Imagine this in your mind's eye for a moment. He's actively, currently, right now, interested. He's vested to the point of becoming human and getting to know us at the level of our struggle and experience and then dying for it. He's interested, and he just wants to know you, like the whole you, the broken bits and all. And I just want to remind you two quick things as we dive in. Number one, forgiveness is possible. Forgiveness is possible. I wish we could just take a moment, and I won't do this to you, but I wish we could just take a moment and have people come up and share story after story after story, a story of yeah, there was a person, there was a situation I didn't think was possible, but forgiveness is possible. I did some things I didn't think God could redeem, and he has. And so I want to remind you that forgiveness is possible. And you see, there's this connection. There's this connection that on one hand, forgiveness is possible, and as a follower of Jesus, you are forgiven. And there's this connection in light of that if you can feel forgiven, you stand a better chance of giving forgiveness to someone else. If you can feel forgiven. A lot of us know this phrase as a follower of Jesus, that you are forgiven. You know that. Great. That's the gospel. Cool. Learned that in pre-K years and years ago. But you know how sometimes I talk about this gap between our head and our heart? What we know to be true and what we experience to be true? What does it feel like to be forgiven this morning? Is that an experience? Is that an emotion? Is that something that is so real for you that it has the power to transform how you view yourself and how you offer forgiveness to others? You are forgiven. So the question is, how do you take that reality? How do you connect your forgiveness from God to how you forgive others? What is forgiveness anyways, and how do you put that into practice? And those are really great questions. Thank you for asking me. Let me take a stab at answering that. And here's the first question. What is forgiveness? What is forgiveness? There's a lot of possible definitions. Theologically, the concept of forgiveness is it's fundamental to the gospel, right? It's about the letting go of something, a debt, an offense. It's about pardoning or not collecting on what was owed. Obviously, Jesus is our best example of this in his life, his sacrifice, his teachings, and I think so much of it theologically can be indexed through Jesus' prayer that he taught us to pray, forgive us our debts as we forgive the debts of others. Building out from that theological basis, you get in the realm of social science, and very simply, it's complicated, it's complex, and it involves about everything. But in those circles, here's a working definition that I present to you. It's that forgiveness is often defined as a conscious, deliberate decision to release feelings of resentment or vengeance toward a person or group has harmed you, regardless of whether they actually deserve your forgiveness. And I would add, even if they haven't asked for it. But let me narrow it down a little bit to us this morning. And here's what I want to anchor as our working definition of forgiveness for the season that we are in. And it is this. It's less about a decision, and it's more about the emotion that comes after the decision. And it's about replacing ill will with good will. Forgiveness often involves replacing ill will with good will for the person who hurt me. Sounds easy enough, right? Let's just go home. That's it. Replace ill will, take it, exchange, take the box of bad feelings and replace it for good. It's as simple as that. It's not as simple as that. So let me nuance that out just a touch, because replacing ill will with goodwill leaves a lot of room for but what about, and they did this, and that doesn't cover this. Let me offer it this way of what forgiveness is not. Number one, forgiveness is not excusing someone's behavior. Forgiveness is not excusing someone's behavior. Catch this. What is forgivable and what is inexcusable are two different things. What is forgivable and what is inexcusable are two different things. Yet, because of Jesus, what is inexcusable does not have to be unforgivable. So don't hear me say replace ill will with goodwill as if that means I'm excusing someone else's sin against you or behavior or trauma or really criminal act. Number two, it's very similar. Forgiveness is not condoning. So watch this. For forgiveness to be real, you have to forgive a real person who hurt you in a real way. You have to forgive an actual person for an actual wrong. Forgiveness does not minimize wrong. And in fact, I'm not going to suss this out today, but it doesn't run contrary to the need for justice. It doesn't minimize it. It doesn't minimize sin or experiences or pain or hurt. On the opposite, actually. It directly looks at the wrong courageously and honestly, and it names it. So if you hear replace ill will, just forgive, you're but you don't know my story. You're right. I may not. I probably don't. Please don't hear me saying that forgiveness is excusing it. Forgiveness is not condoning it. Third, forgiveness is not appeasement. Can everybody say appeasement? Beautiful. This is an interesting one, especially for the conflict avoidant. Any conflict avoiders in the room this morning? I am one of them, and so are you. So let's just avoid So forgiveness is not appeasement. And here's where it comes into play, whether it be fear or a sense of inferiority or a sense of conflict avoidance. Forgiveness by appeasement is a really subtle, this gets hyper-spiritualized a lot in Christian circles. It's a really slick way to just sweep it under the rug to keep the peace. But at the end of the day, you never deal with the root issues in your heart, their heart, in the relationship, and you never actually work through the actual thing. It's saying, I forgive you, as just a flippant way to get past the conversation and never actually have to deal with it. Winston Churchill has this line that he says, an appeaser is somebody who feeds a crocodile hoping it will eat him last. Unforgiveness will eat you up. So forgiveness is not appeasement. And lastly, there could be a lot more on this list. I tried to narrow it down. But forgiveness, I think this is important to name. Forgiveness is not reconciliation. Forgiveness is not reconciliation. So reconciliation is about restoring trust where there hasn't been any, where it's been broken. But trust requires both sides of the relational equation to work together. Reconciliation requires both. And if one person doesn't act in a trustworthy way, and no trust can be built, reconciliation can't happen, right? And a lot of times you'll hear someone, maybe in my position or someone in Christian circles with very well-intentioned heart and meaning kind of mess us up a little bit because we'll make forgiveness the same thing as reconciliation. And reconciliation, it's not always possible. Not always possible. It's always hoped for. It's always hoped for. Paul who he's not contradicting himself throughout his New Testament letters, is right, like God has given us the ministry of reconciliation. Then he also says lines that basically say something like, as much as it's up to you, try to live at peace with everyone. Meaning, do your part, but it's not always possible. And so there's work of boundaries and forgiveness and reconciliation. So can I tell you, reconciliation is always a goal, but you can forgive others even if it doesn't reconcile the relationship. Don't confuse the two. And I think that hurts a lot of us, especially in church circles. Forgiveness is not reconciliation. Of course it's the goal, but it's not always possible. It's not always up to us. So what is forgiveness? Again, to recap, it's not excusing, it's not condoning, it's not appeasing, and it's not reconciliation. Instead, forgiveness, again, is very often about replacing ill will with goodwill. Replacing ill will with goodwill. This isn't in my notes. I think I need to name this. A lot of folks in the room today, well, I'll just say, a lot of folks in conversations I'm having are struggling not with a decision to forgive. They've made the decision, or they know the decision that needs to be made. What they're struggling with is the emotional aftermath of the decision. Meaning, like, I have decided to forgive so-and-so, but it is 8 years later, and I am still just as mad at the sound of their name. And that's confusing, and that's difficult. Some of you may need to make a decision today about who you need to forgive. Some of you may need to back that train way up and say, listen, I need to know what it is to be forgiven, like ultimately by Jesus. I need to experience, I need to connect that emotion, that salvation, that healing, that beginning journey of wholeness and the mending of my heart towards all these spots of brokenness and relationship struggles that are in my life. Some of you have a legit decision to make. But I think there's a whole other often untalked about camp that is like, I've made the decision to forgive. I've said it. We had the conversation, but it is 10 years later, and I am still stuck in anger and bitterness. I have no goodwill for them. I have decided to forgive, but honestly, I still kind of want them to fail. I still kind of want them to be miserable. I kind of want like life to catch up to who they really are. So there's decision, and then there's the emotional aftermath. And what I want to leave you with today is an actual method, a proven framework that's theologically sound and based, that I think it's more at the emotional aftermath of the forgiveness journey and less about go decide to forgive. It's called the REACH method. It's called the REACH method. That makes sense what I just said? Did that land anywhere? Oh gosh. Jesus, could you heal the emotional aftermath of the journey of forgiveness? Mend that. So here's the method. It's a way to take this really abstract, spiritual, just forgive others, receive God's forgiveness, yay, baby Jesus came, and now we have forgiveness. And I don't mean to trivialize that. That is as real as it gets, but it can get so like, okay, a baby in a manger gave us forgiveness. What do I do with that? Still just as mad at my ex-wife as I was. Still just as mad as my kid that won't listen. I'm still just as mad at that boss or that friend or that person or that situation. Just as mad. I'm hurt. This REACH method helps to get into it. And it's an acrostic. It's a white guy in his 80s now, so of course it's an acrostic. That's a funny academic joke. Number one, the R stands for, here's the method, recall the hurt. Recall the, wait a second. To emotionally get past my hurt, you want me to recall the hurt? Cool, I like that. Thanks for that. But here's where he says recall it a little bit differently. You don't recall it through negative rumination, which we talked about last week, but we recall it through what Dr. Worthington calls redemptive remembering. Redemptive remembering. Because forgiveness is not simply forgetting what happened to you as though it didn't happen. Forgetting can actually be pretty dangerous. It's about remembering the wrong, but remembering it differently and learning to remember it without reliving it. There's this epic scene that runs all the way throughout the book of Deuteronomy. It's where the Israelites, under Moses' leadership, have escaped slavery in Egypt. The Exodus has happened. They have escaped Egypt. And part of their custom and tradition that was to have a Sabbath. And tied to that Sabbath was God instructing his people, use the Sabbath as a way to remember your escape from slavery into freedom because of God's love towards you. And so in Deuteronomy, there's this scene where Moses, from God, is giving an instruction to the people to help the kids and the grandkids of those who were in slavery, who didn't escape slavery, remember what it was like. Don't forget the tyranny. Don't forget the hurt. Don't forget the trauma, because what you forget, sometimes you repeat. And so he says in Deuteronomy 4, only be careful and watch yourselves closely so that you do not forget the things your eyes have seen, or let them fade from your heart as long as you live. And then he goes so far as to say, teach them to your children and to their children after them. Don't forget. Then the next chapter in 5, Moses is writing, he says, remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Interesting. Remember, he is asking them to recall the hurt. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. Only now it's not through rumination, it's through redemptive memory, remembering. You're not remembering what made you mad. You're not ruminating on the Pharaoh and your oppressors. You're remembering that God saved you and he freed you by the power of his mighty hand. Then later in chapter 23, this story runs all the way through this theme. Moses has the gumption to say, do not despise an Egyptian because you resided as foreigners in their country. So don't forget what they did to you, but remember how God healed you and set you free. But that's not enough. Somehow, don't despise the offender. Remember, but not through anger and bitterness. Don't nurse the toxic cocktail of resentment and hostility and hatred and judgmentalism and bitterness. Don't let yourself ruminate over it. Which just gives me a pause to ask you this question this morning. When you think back to your story, maybe a present reality or a past reality, who is your Egyptian? Who is your Egyptian? Who is somebody in your life that would be easy for you to despise? Very likely you have someone. And God wants you not to despise them, but to remember them redemptively, to recall the hurt, but no longer as an opportunity to rehearse your victimhood or superiority or hurt or anger. But notice in Moses' practice, he says, remember that God was there. You ever thought of it like that? That God was there in your hurt? And that may present some theological questions you need to work through, maybe some anger complexes at God. That's natural, that's fair. But you ever thought about God's presence with you in your hurt? And that the other person is also someone for whom Jesus has died. And that brings us to E. To empathize with the person who hurt you. Come on, man. Come on. Okay, I'll try to remember less angrily. But you want me to give them empathy? Are you crazy? Are you crazy? Do you want me to walk a mile in their shoes? Is that where this is going? Well, kind of. This is not to justify what they did was right. It's just to say they're human like you. And this is the big question, and it's maybe the way into empathy for you. It's that think about the person. If they were sitting across from you, and there's just a fantastic method you could get into, the empty chair, the two chairs method. But maybe you could sit across from them. Can you imagine what happened or why it happened through the lens of their story? Is that a way into empathy? No, the third thing, is give an altruistic gift of forgiveness. It's altruistic in the sense that they don't deserve to be forgiven, but I'm going to give this gift because I've been given this gift through Jesus. God forgives me on the basis of what Jesus done, and other people have forgiven me when I didn't deserve it. And as crazy as this might sound, I don't want to minimize its significance, but sometimes when you think about reflecting on God's forgiveness of you, you can not let that carry over beyond, oh, well, that's just God. Of course he did. He has to. He's big enough. I'm never like God, so I can't do that. Sometimes you can hyper-focus on God's forgiveness of you that it becomes too distant to make real. But there's an exercise that can help you. Sometimes you just be like, what's a previous time that I forgave someone in an impossible situation? How did that happen? Is this like that? How was God's presence with me then? What did that process look like? And you can give yourself some hope, like, I've actually done this before. And then you want to get a little bit crazy and be like, yeah, and I did this and someone also forgave me. Reflect on that. C, I'm going to go faster here. C is, you have to so give the altruistic gift, and you have to commit to that forgiveness. You have to commit to it. You can say, this doesn't make sense, they don't deserve it, I don't want to, I'm deciding and I'm committing. I'm committing. Write it down. Have a journal. Put it on, make it a mantra in the morning. Put it on your mirror. On such and such a date, I forgave this person. The end. Commit to it. Write it down. In an era of feelings, make this commitment despite our feelings. And then H, you have to hold on to forgiveness when doubt comes. You made a commitment, and then here comes the secondary thoughts. Here comes the doubts. Here comes the questions. Did I really forgive them? How do I know that I forgave them? Do I really want to forgive them? Do they deserve it? And it becomes this cycling loop over and over. So a few weeks ago, I was making a visit, and I was sitting outside of a building, and I could see 5 or 6 cars in front of me. A car stopped in the middle of the 2-lane road. Next car stopped, I'm stopped. And it's not a spot that you should be stopped. There's no pull off. People are starting to get angry. It's a high traffic area. There's honking. Windows are starting to get yelled down. 1 minute becomes 2 minutes, becomes like 5 minutes. And everyone, not expecting it to be like this, had actually kind of boxed one another in so no one can kind of get out. Everyone's stuck. And you could feel through the sound of the horns the collective anger and tension rising. And as that happens, you're just kind of rehearsing in your head, like, what kind of selfish person just pulls over in the middle of a 2-lane street, puts it in park, and holds everyone else up? Like, who do they think they are? And I kid you not, a few minutes later, a dad, probably in his early 60s, comes wheeling out, a daughter or a granddaughter who's in a wheelchair. We're sitting in front of a doctor's building. She had an appointment. And he's kind of giving the wave, like, I'm sorry. He puts his hands up. Just a dad or a grandpa, I don't know, taking care of a loved one, wheels her to the car, lifts her 20 to 30, not a kid, young adult body into the car, loads up and folds up the wheelchair, puts it in the trunk, gets in the driver's seat, and pulls off. The story I was making up in my mind about this person was way different 5 minutes earlier. When the reality check occurred, things changed. And in this emotionally driven side of the journey of forgiveness, we're always telling ourselves stories about other people. We're always telling ourselves stories about ourselves. And which version of that story, of someone's story, are you telling? What is the story that I'm telling? Might there be room for another one, a more redemptive story to tell? What's the story I'm telling about myself and the person who offended me? Am I holding on to my anger? Am I stripping them of their humanity? Am I rehearsing things that bring ill will and de-dignify that they are a created person and loved by God, paid for and purchased by Jesus' blood, the same as mine? Or am I figuring out how not to ruminate, but to remember redemptively? Am I giving space where there isn't? I think there's a strong reality that if I don't feel forgiven myself, then I lose the power to offer it to other people. And so I want to invite you to stand this morning. And I feel really strongly about these next two things that I want to name for us. I said it earlier, I want to ask you again, if you feel like a screw up this morning, welcome. We're all here together in this together. God loves you no less. And if you want to be less screwed up, let's offer it back to Jesus. I want to ask you to actually raise your expectation towards this statement. And if you're like, yeah, I know this, wake up this reality in you that forgiveness is possible. So I want to invite you in to just close your eyes for a moment. Take this posture with your feet firmly planted and your hands out, your palms open if you're willing, just a sign of surrender. A sign that says, even I don't know that I'm fully open to this, but maybe through my body and my mind that I can kind of open this up for myself. And in this game of forgiveness, I want to name two specific things this morning. I was up at, well, it was a weird night. Liza had it way worse than I did, but I was up at 2:30. There's a crying baby, and the 3-year-old's climbing in our room. She's thirsty, and, every night. And she's kicking me in the side, and I'm trying to keep my dad anger at bay. And I literally uttered this phrase at about 2:40 this morning. And I said, God, thank you for the gift of frustration. I said, thank you for the gift of frustration. I want to become a less frustrated person. And so I'm going to see my frustration as an invitation right now at 2:40 in the morning. And so I want to pivot that back to you this morning. When it comes to forgiveness or relationships, your sense of being forgiven and giving forgiveness, feeling like a screw up, feel like you're on the mountaintop, whatever, is there a place of frustration in this journey that instead of burying you in shame and self-contempt, resentment, can be reframed as an invitation to surrender? And there's this little phrase I've come across in the recent weeks, and it's been written in my journal or my notes as often as I'm journaling right now. And it's just this. And I would encourage you can say it out loud if you want, if this resonates, or just kind of say it inward. Like, it's just this little phrase that says, I can't, but God can. I think I'll let him. I can't, but God can, and I think I'll let him. So that's the first thing I want to name. Where is there frustration in this journey, in relationships, with your relationship with yourself? Forgiveness is part of that. Rather than it being an obstacle, is it an invitation? The second thing I want to name is church hurt. I want to name it very specifically today. It is no secret that we are a church that God is sending fellow sojourners who have had negative experiences in the church. My generation is quite disillusioned with the church right now. And that's fair. It's okay. This is a safe place to work that out. We are becoming a church for hurting people, and church hurt is part of that. And I was praying, I was thinking about this whole idea of disillusionment, and even what's wrapped up in that term. If you're in here today or online, or you catch this months down the road on your journey of like, do I come to church? Do I not? Is this a safe place? Hear me pretty explicitly today. To be disillusioned is to, think about that term, is to lose the illusion. It's to lose the illusion. Guys, people will hurt you. The church will screw up. It has. We will one to another. I just can't lose this idea that disillusionment, if we park our identity and our future and in that lane of disillusion, we are missing the opportunity that there's an invitation to lose the illusion of bad expectation or false hopes and exchange it for the reality of what this really is. I want us to be a home for hurting people, as safe as humanly possible to work through that journey. But I also want to name and implore and plead and offer you an invitation into, please don't let disillusionment and hurt forever shape your identity. Don't set up there forever. Stay there as you need to. But hear me this morning. Some of you are not ready to take that step. Others, I want to invite you from hurt and into healing, from rumination into redemptive remembering, from ill will into goodwill, out of fear of what will happen next and into love with Jesus and his bride, the church, the imperfect, messy, human, forgiving view of what the kingdom is to be. If we can learn to forgive one another, to forgive ourselves, to forgive circumstances, we can offer the world what we are meant to offer. That is a journey, and that may not be for everyone, but odds are there is someone, maybe just one in the room, that God is speaking very directly to begin to transition from hurt into healing, from ill will to goodwill, from fear to love, specifically tied to your church hurt. So come, Holy Spirit. We can't, and you can. We want to let you. Come, Holy Spirit. Flip our frustration into an invitation, and flip our hurt, our hurting identities to places of mending. We can't. I can't. You can. We want to let you.